Hello everybody and welcome back to the Data Playbook. So this video is meant to go over the Sunday games, starting with the 9:30 game in the morning with Denver at the Jets, which is really in London. So let's get to it. So comparing this matchup, you have the Jets as the only winless team left in the league, which gives the Broncos a heavy favored money line with a spread of 7.5 and a total point line of 43.5. Going through the team's individual ranks that we have, you have the Broncos with a passing rank of 17, a rushing rank of 4, an allowed passing rank of 16, and an allowed rushing rank of 5. The Jets have a passing rank of 26, a rushing rank of 3, an allowed passing rank of 11, and an allowed rushing rank of 27. So looking at this right off the bat, you have the Jets who have a pretty good rushing team, but the Broncos who can stop the rush pretty well, while the Broncos are one of the best rushing teams in the league, and the Jets are one of the worst at stopping the rush. So on average, Denver gets a little bit more than 220 passing yards per game and just under 141 rushing yards per game. They have averaged almost one passing interception per game, only 0.8 interceptions per game, which I think comes out to 4. Yep, 4 passing interceptions total on the season. And on average, they suffer 1 sack per game. The Jets, on the other hand, get just over 201 passing yards per game and a little over 144 rushing yards per game. They've had 1 interception this season, and they suffer 3.2 sacks on average per game. Defensively, the Broncos allow 226 passing yards per game and just 88.4 rushing yards per game. The Jets allow 214 passing yards per game and a little over 140 rushing yards per game. Here's where the Broncos really stand out. They get 9.6 QB hits per game on average, while the Jets only get 2.8 QB hits per game. The Broncos defense has had 1 passing interception this season and averaged 4.2 sacks per game, while the Jets have had no interceptions and only average 1.4 sacks per game. Looking into our quarterbacks, you have Bo Nix for the Broncos and Justin Fields for the Jets. Bo Nix has 84.1 fantasy points this season. That's an average of 16.8 fantasy points per game. And Justin Fields has 86.6 fantasy points this season, coming out for an average of 21.6 fantasy points per game. Bo Nix does have 4 passing interceptions this season, with 5 sacks suffered and 1 sack fumble loss, while Justin Fields has no interceptions, but 1 sack fumble loss and 1 rushing fumble loss, with a total of 10 sacks suffered this season. As we saw before for the team, Bo Nix gets an average of 220 passing yards per game. He does get an average of 20 rushing yards per game, while Justin Fields gets 188.5 passing yards per game, since he was missing one of those games in there, and 51 rushing yards per game. That average is brought down in week 2, where he got hurt against Buffalo, and only has 27 passing yards in that game. Otherwise, for all the games he stayed healthy, including last week, with his high of 283, he's managed to stay over 200 passing yards. While Bo's been a little bit less consistent, with his worst week of 153 passing yards, and his best week right after that against Cincinnati with 326 passing yards. His latest performance had 242 passing yards. If we go into the running backs, you have J.K. Dobbins for the Broncos and Breece Hall for the Jets. Dobbins has 66.5 fantasy points this season, 72.5 in PPR. That's an average of 13.3 fantasy points per game, or 14.5 in PPR. Breece Hall has 14.8 fantasy points this season. That's 65.1 PPR. Breece Hall has 48.1 fantasy points this season, 65.1 in PPR. That's an average of 9.6 fantasy points per game, or 13 in PPR. And the only fumble between these two comes from Breece Hall. If we look at their season averages, J.K. Dobbins gets just over 80 rushing yards per game, while Breece Hall just gets over 70 rushing yards per game. Breece Hall does win in the receiving matchup with 30 receiving yards per game, while Dobbins only gets 4.6 receiving yards per game. If we look at the week-by-week data, you have J.K. Dobbins with his best week in week 4 with 100 rushing yards, and his worst week in week 1 with 63 rushing yards. Breece Hall has had 2 games over 100 rushing yards, with 107 rushing yards in the first week and 113 last week. But he's had 2 consecutive weeks in the middle of the season here, week 2 and 3, where he's only had 29 rushing yards and 21 rushing yards. So Breece Hall has been a little less consistent. And if we jump into the top receivers, you have Courtland Sutton for the Broncos and Garrett Wilson for the Jets. Sutton's had 54.5 fantasy points this season, 80.5 in PPR. That's an average of 10.9 or 16.1 in PPR. Garrett Wilson's had 62.2 fantasy points, 95.2 in PPR, an average of 12.4 fantasy points per game, or 19 in PPR. Neither of these players have given up a turnover, even though Garrett Wilson's had a fumble, but he did not manage to actually lose the fumble. On average, Sutton gets 73 receiving yards per game, and very closely, Garrett Wilson gets 76.4 receiving yards per game. Sutton's best week comes in week 3 with 118 receiving yards, and his worst week in week 2 with only 6 receiving yards. But he's been pretty good as of late with 81 and 99 as his latest 2 games, while Garrett Wilson is much more consistent with his best week being week 1 with 95 receiving yards. He's had a couple where he's at 84 and 82, his worst week in week 2 with 50, and last week with 71. That gives both these guys the largest share as we would expect for number 1 receivers, but Garrett Wilson getting almost half of his team's receiving yards, where Courtland Sutton's almost more closer to a third of the receiving yards on the team. And of course, going through our tight ends, you have Evan Ingram for the Broncos and Mason Taylor for the Jets. Evan Ingram gets 15.5 fantasy points this season, 27.5 on PPR. He averages 3.8 fantasy points per game, or 6.8 in PPR. Mason Taylor gets 19.5 fantasy points this season, 39.5 in PPR. That's an average of 3.9 fantasy points per game, or 7.9 in PPR. So, relatively close numbers if we look just at fantasy, although Evan Ingram has been out one additional game here. If we look into week by week, Evan Ingram is pretty consistent with about 21, 29, 33. His worst week with 12 receiving yards. Best week last week with 33. Mason Taylor with a high of 67 and 65 over the last couple weeks. And his worst week in week 2 with 5 receiving yards. So maybe he's starting to be more involved in the game plan here. That does give both these guys a smaller piece of the pie, of course, with Mason Taylor getting a little larger, almost 16.6% of the total receiving yards on the team. While Ingram here, and it's a little still broken, but gets a little less, probably less than 10, maybe 7 or 8% of the team's receiving share. And there we have it for our Sunday morning game with Denver at the Jets in London. I hope that everybody enjoyed and that there was something useful out of that. If so, leave a like and subscribe, and comment on what else could be better in the future. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.